Hi guys, welcome to episode 4 of Painting Pretty with Kristen Lynn Art. In today's episode, I'm going to show you how I prime and gesso my wood panels before I start painting them. And then on the flip side, I'm going to show you how I varnish them once the painting's complete. I'm going to use these materials here, and I'll show you what these are in a little more detail soon. But I just want to say, before you go invest in a giant bottle of this varnish or something like that, test some different products out. It's taken me years of trial and error to find out what works best for me, and there are a lot of different options out there, especially with varnish. So find out what works best for you by buying like a tiny size first. But that all being said, I'm going to walk you through what these are in detail, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through the supplies we're using. To start off, we have the Baltic birchwood panels that I typically paint on. These are 11 by 14 in size. I buy a pack of 5 of these for about $17 at Blick. That's a pretty good deal to get 5 panels. They do come out of the package kind of rough. They're like still coated in sawdust and they have some kind of rough splintery edges, but I will show you how we clean those up once we get started. Okay, up next we have the Golden brand Acrylic Primer. This is going to be the first thing we put down on the wood panel. Okay, up next we have Liquitex Clear Gesso. I'm choosing to use clear gesso today, but you can definitely use white, or they do have other colors. But I like to use the clear gesso on the wood panels so that the wood grain texture shows through. And up next we have our varnish. Today I'm going to be using Gamblin brand Gamvar Matte Varnish. Typically I always use a matte varnish, but that really is my personal taste. Gamvar is also available in satin and gloss finishes. And now we have our brushes. So I bought this 3-pack of brushes from Michaels for about $5. Definitely inexpensive brushes. They're soft synthetic brushes, and that's really all you need for this. I don't recommend using anything more expensive. There's just no need. And then finally, we have our sandpaper. This is actually a fine grit angled sanding sponge. They use these a lot for things like drywall and larger areas. I just like to use this block instead of regular sandpaper just because it's easier to hold. Typically, I look for the finer grit sandpaper to use. And this is actually the first tool we're going to be using today. So let's get started sanding. Okay, so we have our wood panel and we have our sanding block. Typically I sand outside just to keep the sawdust out of my studio, but I'm gonna sand inside today for you guys. It's just a little easier to video that way. But I start by sanding the edges of these wood panels. They're always really, really rough to the touch and almost kind of splintery. So you have to sand them really, really well to smooth them out. And then I will sand the front and the back really well. I do want the back to be really smooth as well, even though you're not going to be painting on it. You still want it to look nice. I actually sign most of my paintings on the back as well. So I do consider it a part of the piece of art, even though it's not what you're going to be looking at most of the time. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and grab that acrylic primer. I have it squeezed out on a sheet of disposable palette paper next to my wood panel, and then I've grabbed the 1-inch brush that we're gonna apply the primer with. Now, primer is a really important first step when you're painting on wood. It's basically creating a seal between the wood and the oil paint, and it's gonna kind of help fill in some of the uneven wood grain so you have a smoother surface to start painting on. It's very likely if you don't use primer that your paint isn't going to coat evenly on the wood, and over time it could actually get worse and kind of fade in places that you can't really control. It may take more paint or more layers to really get the saturated colors that you want if you don't prime it first. So I highly recommend this step even before you put down the gesso. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and grab that clear gesso now. Before you apply your gesso, you wanna make sure you've let the primer dry for 24 hours. and then you're actually going to sand one more time after the primer dries. So you're going to sand the whole wood panel, make sure it's totally smooth, and then you're okay to start your gesso. So once again, we're going to use the 1-inch brush to generously apply a coat of the gesso over the whole front of the wood panel. It's going to appear a little white, even though we're using the clear gesso. It will appear a little white at first, but don't worry, it will dry totally clear. And then I typically apply 3 layers of gesso. So I'll let this first layer dry 24 hours. Once again, I'll sand, and then I will do that 2 more times. Once I've applied 3 layers of gesso and let it completely dry, I'll sand 1 more time, and then we'll be ready to paint. And like magic, we have a finished painting. So I actually did a full tutorial of how to paint this blue sky in episode 3 of Painting Pretty. So if you want to go back and check that out, you can. But now it's time to varnish it. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and grab that Gamblin' Gamvar varnish. I am pouring it into a separate container that we're going to apply from. You may have seen varnishing videos before. I think I may have even done some where you actually pour the varnish onto the painting and then spread it from there with a brush. I found this doesn't always work great because sometimes you can get too much varnish on your painting and then it can dry a little thick or sticky, and it's just not a good way to get an even coverage. So I find I can control it a lot better if I apply it from a separate container. So I just use crisscross strokes to apply it, and then I'll go back afterwards and smooth it out with really, really uniform horizontal and vertical strokes. Now, I mentioned earlier, I'm using a matte varnish, and that's really my personal preference. The varnish is a very satisfying part of the process. No matter what type of finish you're using, it's going to really make your colors pop and just take your painting to another level. But I like the matte finish because it's just a little more understated. I don't typically like the gloss. I don't like my paintings to look super shiny, but that could be just a phase I'm going through. I don't know. I just really love how a matte finish looks with the really smooth surface of a wood panel. Now, one thing that could be really helpful to you is you can actually remove varnish. If for some reason you're not happy with the finish or you need to go back and make a change to a painting, you can use Gamblin' Gamsol to remove the varnish. And I've done this before, it works. My mind was actually blown how well it worked. I had varnished something with a gloss finish and I didn't like it. So I went back and I removed it with a Gamsol and then applied a new varnish, and it worked amazing. So Gamsol in general is a really amazing tool to have in the studio. It's good for a lot of different things, so I highly recommend getting some. So before your varnish dries, it's still going to look shiny for a little while, but it will dry completely in 24 hours and you will have a beautiful matte finish when you're complete. And that's it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next episode of Painting Pretty.